illallah Muhammad Rasulullah La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا ونبينا ومولانا محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي السلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته أهلا وسهلا ومرحبا بكم. I welcome you to our live answer session conducted according to the Shafi'i school of thought where madhab applicable, otherwise according to Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. As is customary, we have our prepared questions from what was sent in, and if you have any questions that you wish for us to address during the session bi'idhnillah ta'ala, you are welcome to send them through on the chat section of the platform that this is reaching you on bi'idhnillah. So let us commence. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Is it permissible to ignore abnormal discharge if it is not menstrual fluid? Is it permissible to ignore abnormal discharge if it is not menstrual fluid? Tamam. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. So firstly, when you say is it permissible to ignore, what exactly does that mean, right? When you ask a question about Islamic sacred law, because you are dealing with what is essentially law or ahkam, we have to be specific so that the answer can be tailor-made specifically as well. So, of course, if it is not menstrual blood or if it is not related to menstrual blood, so it's not the discharge before or after the period, but it's normal discharge, natural discharge, then in terms of can you ignore it, firstly, it is not menstrual blood, so therefore you can ignore it as not being part of menstrual blood if that was the question. However, if the question is pertaining to the purification of this discharge, then there's something to discuss here. So Imam Ibn Hajar al-Haytami rahimahullah ta'ala, he classified vaginal moisture or discharge in one of three ways. So the first is that it is considered pure. So the moisture or mucus that sometimes exits a woman's private parts is usually whitish between that which is called madhi, right, and perspiration. If it exits from an area of the private part, that must be washed in a ghusl, right? So normally in a ghusl, the recommendation is for women to squat or to wash that which would normally be revealed of their private part when they squat. So if it's from that area, if it exits from an area of the private part that must be washed during a ghusl, then this is considered pure. This is considered absolutely pure, so there's absolutely no need to wash it away or to consider it as najasa because it is pure. The second type of discharge is considered impure, and this is when it exits from an area of the vagina that does not require washing in a purificatory bath, so when it's deeper than what must be washed during a ghusl. Then there's the third type of discharge. If it is moisture that exits from an area between the aforementioned areas, so it's not from the outer area of the private part, nor is it from deep within the private part, it is in between that. There are differing views about this, but the official view of the school, of the Shafi'i school, is that it is pure, it is not najasa, and this comes from the Hashiyatul Jamal ala Sharh al-Manhaj. Now, this classification should, inshaAllah ta'ala, answer the question succinctly. Is it permissible to ignore? It is, depending on what exactly you mean thereby. It's not part of menstrual blood as you've already identified. Can you ignore it on a daily basis? That's not a shari'i question. Obviously, we need to try to be clean all the time, but from a shari'i perspective, it is not considered to be impure according to the classification that we've just unpacked, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. We proceed, inshallah. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Can I follow a different madhab, or can I follow different madhabs, plural, based on convenience? So the way the question is worded here, again, allows for some clarification. Generally speaking, Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah holds it as the most beneficial and the biggest recommendation in terms of following a madhab, that each Muslim should follow one particular madhab predominantly. And there are several factors for this. Every madhab is essentially a comprehensive interpretation of the Quran and the Sunnah in the various aspects of one's life. To coherently follow the Quran and Sunnah and not end up contradicting oneself or one's practice, you follow one madhab because it systematically interprets the Quran and the Sunnah according to standard and standardized principles, right? Usul. The reason why we don't follow all of the madhahib all of the time is simply because of the inconvenience that it would cause, both in terms of practice as well as in terms of learning, right? To learn one madhab thoroughly can take an entire lifetime. So for the average person to know the rules of all of the madhahib it's actually quite difficult, if at all possible. So when it comes to the standard rule, we should generally follow one particular madhab. This is the way of Ahlus Sunnah wal Jama'ah. Then the second part, I'm breaking up the question. The second part is, can you then follow a different madhab, right? So there is an extensive answer that you may find on SeekersGuidance.org, and it actually is titled, Can I follow another school or madhab when I need to? Now notice this question is asked differently to the one that was posed. The one that was posed said, can I follow different madhabs, plural, based on convenience? This one says, when I need to. So if it is purely based on convenience as the question is posed, then no, you cannot follow all the madhabs simply when it is convenient as it is convenient. This would technically be what is considered as tatabbu'ur rukhas, which is the active pursuit of conveniences or of dispensations. So to always look, what's the easiest way in this particular mas'ala? What's the easiest way in this issue? What's the easiest way in that issue? And I'll always just follow the easiest way. If that's your intention behind following a different madhab, that you are deliberately going to pursue these conveniences, then this is problematic, because two issues are actually problematic when it comes to following different schools of thought. The one is essentially inconsistency, right? You're following one school in this particular rule, and then you combine it with a different school's rule, and you end up with something that neither schools, or any of the schools for that matter, agree is valid. So you have something that you've concocted that's now invalid. This is called talfiq, right? So it's a form of inconsistency. The second problem with following multiple madhahib that is categorized by most scholars as being unlawful is this one, tatabbu'ur rukhas, right? So to deliberately pursue conveniences. But now, this is theoretical. In practical life, to actually attain tatabbu'ur rukhas, one needs to be very well versed in all of the schools of thought. So generally speaking, even scholars of deen who have specialized in one particular school, they don't, number one, they won't do tatabbu'ur rukhas, and number two, it would be impractical for them to do so, because it means that you have to study every issue and deliberately pursue the easiest route, or the one that offers the biggest dispensation in every ruling. That's quite a tall order. So theoretically, it's impermissible, but from a practical perspective, it's not really something that the average person can do. As for changing the question slightly and asking it in the way that we addressed it on Seekers Guidance Answer Service, can I follow another school when I need to, when there's a reason for me to? Now, Shafi'is normally ask this question when it comes to what breaks my wudu, and can I follow the Hanafi school or one of the other schools of thought in saying that when I touch my spouse, my wudu is not broken. That's normally the one that people ask about. But assuming that that's not the case, and it's some other ruling, generally speaking, a madhab is not a prison, it is a convenience, it is a facilitation to practice the Quran and the Sunnah. We are not duty bound by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There's no particular ruling that says you must follow this madhab or that, or that you must remain loyal to one particular school of thought. Rather, what we are duty bound by is to follow the Quran and the Sunnah. And if you don't have the ability to follow the Quran and the Sunnah directly, because you lack the necessary qualities of ijtihad or the qualifications of independent reasoning, then your other option is taqleed, which is to follow the knowledge of a qualified, reliable, trustworthy scholar who provides you with the interpretation of the Quran and the Sunnah. And the system of the Ummah was such that we don't follow just the opinions of one particular scholar, but rather a school of thought where hundreds and hundreds of scholars contribute to a single interpretational legacy called a madhab that presents us with the rules of the Quran and the Sunnah, the rules of Islam in other words, in a coherent and consistent manner. So this is not a prison, this is facilitation of practicing deen. If a need arises that calls for you to leave your madhab for whatever reason and adopt another view, whether it be because this other view was it's the only view that made it possible for you to practice on, so a necessity, or whether it is because of a convenience, as you put it. There's no necessity in adopting a view that says, touching your spouse won't break the wudu. Some say that when you go to Makkah and you perform tawaf and sa'i, then it's very difficult to follow the Shafi'i school because you're so in close proximity with people of the opposite sex that the chances are you're going to break your wudu all the time. So there, you may argue that there's a need for it. But generally on a day-to-day basis, there's no need, there's no darura for it. If you have wudu, avoid touching your spouse if you would like to keep your wudu, or renew your wudu. But can you follow that opinion anyways, regardless of the fact that it's not a need or it's not something that is essential? The answer is yes. You may do so as long as you avoid the two rules, the two cardinal sins when it comes to following a particular madhab, which is to not fall into inconsistencies by chopping and changing the rules of an issue to the point where you end up with something that is not valid by anyone. So for example, in the Shafi'i school, bleeding does not break the wudu. Under certain circumstances in the Hanafi school, bleeding would break the wudu. In the Shafi'i school, touching the private part of a human being with the insides of one's hands would break the wudu. In the Hanafi school, this rule is not applied as such. In the Shafi'i school, touching one's wife with no barrier in between or any member of the opposite sex who is not a mahram would break the wudu. In the Hanafi school, that doesn't apply. So now if you mix and match what breaks the wudu and what does not break the wudu from both madhahib, and you have wudu, then you bleed profusely, and you've touched your private part, and you've touched your wife, and a couple of other things as well. And then for the one point you say, well, in this I'm following the Shafi'i school, in the other I'm following the Hanafi school, in the other I'm following the Maliki school. Number one, this is not going to be something that the average Muslim can do because it requires extensive knowledge. And number two, this is not something that a Muslim is allowed to do because you can see that you'll end up with something that is not valid by any of those madhahib, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. So can you follow another madhab for the sake of convenience or for the sake of need? Yes, as long as you don't do so incessantly, deliberately, always looking for the dispensations, and as long as you don't mix and match matters so that you end up with something that is not valid by any of the schools that you claim to be following, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. If you have a specific situation and you're worried about these matters that I've alerted you to, then the best thing to do is to consult a scholar on the specific situation where you wish to adopt the opinion of another school. Wallahu subhanahu wa ta'ala a'lam. We proceed to the next question. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Is it haram to purchase items from shops that do not pay their workers fairly? Is it haram? So there's two separate issues here. It would be haram for those who own the business to abuse their employees and to not pay them fairly. It would be wrong for them to do so. However, that's between the owners of the business and the employees, because the employees under normal circumstances would not be coerced to working there. And they would technically have agreed, right? They would have contractually agreed to work a certain amount and to get paid a certain amount. And if that is the case, then to call it unfair is questionable. Unless there's a general market problem where there's a lack of employment, and people, are sort of coerced into taking anything that they can find, and then they are exploited by their employees. It's still wrong, but the contractual issue that we really are concerned with here is, did they mutually agree upon a salary? So that's a separate issue. As for your supporting of that business, is it halal for you to go and make a purchase at that business? If it is a halal product and the transaction is done in a halal manner, then there's no problem with doing so. If there is malpractice to such an extent that people are being abused and their rights are being usurped, and this obviously upsets you, and it should, then while it would be permissible to go and support that business and to buy something there, ethically you may choose to not support that business because you are not happy with the principles. But better still is to act on what you feel, but at the same time alert the business to the fact that we are not supporting you because from an ethical perspective you mistreat your workers or you abuse them or something of the sort. So we should manage things in a specific manner and not just conflate everything together. If the business is doing something problematic, then you have man ra'a minkum munkaran, right? The Prophet ﷺ said, if you see something wrong, change it with your hand. If you cannot, then speak out against it. And if you cannot, then feel bad about it. So here you see something wrong, take action, right? Go and do something about it. Speak to the business. If that doesn't work, take the next action. But you cannot, because of one, malpractice or what is in your view something wrong, automatically turn other permissible things, because they are related, into a haram action as well, right? The same thing works with boycotts, essentially. If you are boycotting certain brands because you are making a political statement or you are supporting a particular cause, there's no issue with that, right? To make a statement with your money, with your finances. However, to then go a step beyond that and to say it is haram to purchase that product, or it is haram to consume that product because they are associated with a particular type of oppression or the like, that is not appropriate. لا تحرموا ما أحل الله لك. We cannot make haram what Allah Ta'ala had permitted. We have to separate the issues enough to be able to say, well, on the one hand, something is ethically, it's problematic for us. And from an ethical perspective, we want to voice our dissatisfaction with the status quo by not supporting financially. And that's fine, right? You have a choice as to who you support and where you buy your things from. There's no coercion in that. But don't go a step further and now, say it is haram to do so, thereby superimposing your political standpoint or your protest or your boycott or your form of action onto somebody else. There may be a circumstance or a need or whatever the case may be that justifies that person's transaction that you are not aware of. There may be a different form of protest or a different form of expressing their view that you are not aware of. So these things are matters that we need to deal with sensitivity. Wallahu subhanahu wa ta'ala a'lam. We move on to the next question, inshallah ta'ala. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Do I need to check for alcohol or animal ingredients in the perfumes that I use? Do I need to check for alcohol or animal ingredients in the perfumes that I use? Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. There are two issues here. The first issue is about alcohol and the other issue is about animal ingredients. So as for alcohol, we have many questions, or rather many answers on the Seekers Guidance Answer Service about the status quo of alcohol according to the Shafi'i school. Now, the strict view and the official view of the Shafi'i school is that liquid intoxicants are impermissible. Not impermissible, liquid intoxicants are najasa. They are impermissible to consume, but of course we are speaking here about the impurity of the substance. So this would obviously include alcohol. Alcohol would be the primary intoxicant that is in liquid form, and this is going to be prevalent in many items. So the strict view in the Shafi'i school and the original rule is that liquid intoxicants are impure. So if a little bit of alcohol, according to the strict view, is added to some perfume for whatever purpose, preservation, to make it last longer, etc., that would render the entire contents of that perfume bottle, assuming that it is less than 200 liters, which is probably the case, it would render the entire thing as mutanajjis. It is contaminated by najasa. The problem herein is to apply this rule for Shafi'is in the contemporary world would make life practically impossible. Why? Because of the principle of umumul balwa. Alcohol in the modern era, post-industrialized world, is used as a solvent and as a catalyst within many, many other chemical reactions, whether that be within paints or clothing dye or, a plethora of other issues. So just dye alone, if I'm looking around me now, the paint on the walls, the dye of the fabric, the items of plastic around you, they all contain traces of alcohol that was probably utilized while the substance was still in its liquid form. So plastics, before they become molded, they probably had some ethanol alcohol within the process. This would mean that practically everything is contaminated with najasa if you strictly want to practice the original rule. However, other scholars differed as to the nature of a liquid intoxicant, and some have disagreed with this ruling, saying that it is not najasa. The likes of the teacher of Imam Malik rahimahullah ta'ala, Ismail ibn Yahya al-Muzani, the student of Imam Shafi'i, and many others. So there's a genuine difference of opinion as to the status quo of the alcohol or liquid intoxicants. Contemporaneously, Shafi'i scholars understand this umumul balwa and the difficulty in avoiding alcohol as a chemical component in daily life. So for that reason, the vast majority of scholars mention, even the Shafi'i school mention, that because of the general unavoidable nature of the situation, it is something that would be overlooked. It is ma'fuun anhu. But despite this ruling, when you have the option to avoid alcohol and the usage of alcohol with ease, right? Even though there's a dispensation because of the wide prevalence of something or the ubiquitous nature of this thing, that doesn't mean that we should then completely ignore the madhab, completely ignore the original ruling and say, well, then in that case, we'll just indulge as much as we want. Instead, the more cautious approach would be that when you are given the option between something that does contain alcohol and something that doesn't, then prefer that which does not contain the alcohol, bearing in mind still that the principle still applies. Whether you follow the stricter view or not, it's again something that cannot be superimposed on anybody else because of the difficulty in doing so. So this is in relation to alcohol, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. So if you choose to avoid perfumes with alcohol in based on the strict ruling, Bismillah, go for it. It's a choice. Still know that there's alcohol in so many other things that you are interacting with on a daily basis. Secondly, when we look at animal ingredients, right? It depends. What ingredient are we speaking about and from which animal and to what extent? So ideally, if you are uncertain about the nature of the animal that has been utilized, then it is best to avoid it, because for the believer, when in doubt, do without. The Prophet ﷺ said that truthfulness is a source of contentment. Inna sidqa tuma'nina. Wal kadhib, and falsehood, ribatun, is a source of doubt. So for that reason, he said, Da' ma yuribuka ila ma la yuribuk. Leave that which causes you doubt for that which causes you no doubt. So you understand what the madhab says, the strict ruling of the madhab and the dispensation. And then when it comes to animal byproducts, there's also discussion on whether it is gelatin or rennet and the like. There are substances and there's differences about these substances. You decide on your approach, follow valid scholarship, and once you've taken that approach, also become tolerant of other views in that regard, because your view that you've chosen to follow is not the only view. If you choose to take the precautious stance, فَبِهَا وَنَعِمَتْ. Excellent. That would be more prudent for you, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. But if not, and you take the dispensation for the sake of ease, or you practice accordingly for the sake of others and their ease, then that is also perfectly acceptable. Wallahu subhanahu wa ta'ala a'lam. Yuridu Allahu bikum al-yusra wa la yuridu bikum al-usra. Allah wants ease for you, He does not want difficulty for you, and Allah knows best. Tamam. So if you have any further specific questions about the usage of alcohol or animal products within perfume, and it's a problem for you, then my advice would be, for your sake, to find halal alternatives that contain no alcohol, that contain no traces of any animals within them, and stick to that, and that would be better for you. But understand that there's differences and they need to be respected, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. We proceed, inshallah ta'ala. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Does dissatisfaction with Allah's decree affect one's faith? This depends on what exactly the circumstance meant. So, dissatisfaction with Allah's decree. Does this mean that something happened? As an example, somebody close to you had passed away and it hurts and you feel upset about it. If this is the case, this does not necessarily mean that your iman is at flow. If dissatisfaction with Allah's decree leads the believer to say, why did this happen to me? I don't deserve this. Why did Allah do this to me? Now, of course, this is a different issue altogether. A believer does not need to take the situation that they are in and just accept it as it is. A believer can strive and make dua and aspire to remove themselves from that situation. But the believer knows that everything is in the control of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The good and the bad, nothing can happen except by the permission, the power and the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So rida bil qada is part of the believer's toolkit in life. Rida means to be pleased bil qada, with the decree of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is why for the believer, when something happens, they say, qaddar Allahu wa ma sha fa'ala. It is as Allah decreed, and whatever Allah wants, He does. Right? When something happens and we find dissatisfaction with the outcome of something, again, it's not about the feeling of I want to resist what just took place, or I'm not satisfied with where I find myself currently. That's not the issue. The issue is, how do you respond to that, right? If as a believer you respond by turning to Allah and making dua, oh Allah, I'm really unhappy about what had taken place. Please change the situation for me. Oh Allah, grant me better than this. Oh, this is fine. This is absolutely fine, because the believer is now turning to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But if what you mean by dissatisfaction is, I'm displeased with Allah, or I'm blaming Allah for something that I feel should not have happened, now this is problematic. And if you find yourself in that situation, the best way to address that is to go and renew your faith. Go and renew your iman. Remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala abundantly. La ilaha illallah, la hawla wa la quwwata illa billahi al-aliyyil azim. Remind yourself that you are not in charge. I'm not in charge. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is in charge. But still, you can certainly turn to Allah and make dua. Oh Allah, remove this from me. Remove this situation. Allah, change what has happened here. You don't have to just, anything that happens, Alhamdulillah, oh Allah, thank you for taking this person away from me. Oh Allah, thank you for ending the marriage. No, we don't have to do that. So it's all about our response. Wallahu subhanahu wa ta'ala a'lam. And I mean, this comes from the Quran as well. If we look, for example, there are many verses that speak about this, but if one looks, for example, at Surah Al-Fajr, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والفجر وليال عشر والشفع والوتر والليل إذا يسر هل في ذلك قسم لذي حجر ألم تر كيف فعل ربك بعاد إرم ذات العماد التي لم يخلق مثلها في البلاد وثمود الذين جابوا الصخر بالواد وفرعون ذي الأوتاد الذين طغوا في البلاد فأكثروا فيها الفساد فصب عليهم ربك سوط عذاب إن ربك لبالمرصاد. فأما الإنسان, I recited all of that just to get to this middle portion here. فأما الإنسان إذا ما ابتلاه ربه فأكرمه ونعمه فيقول ربي أكرمن. Humans, they've been created as such that when Allah honors them and blesses them and gives them, then they say, Rabbi akraman, my Lord has blessed me and honored me. وَأَمَّا إِذَا مَا ابْتَلَاهُ فَقَدَرَ عَلَيْهِ رِزْقَهُ فَيَقُولُ رَبِّي أَهَانًا. And as for when Allah Ta'ala tests him and He restricts that person's rizq, وَقَدَرَ عَلَيْهِ رِزْقَهُ, He restricts the rizq a bit. فَيَقُولُ رَبِّي أَهَانًا, then he says, my Lord has disgraced me. So notice here, both instances are tests from Allah. When Allah honors the person, when Allah graces the person with gifts and blesses them with abundance, that's a test. And when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala restricts and keeps away, that's also a test. Two different natures of the tests, but they are both tests. And what's more important is the response of the person. In the first instance, the person said, Rabbi akraman, so he's attributing the good to Allah. But in the second instance, he says, Rabbi ahanan, now my Lord has disgraced me. I don't look at it as a test anymore. I don't look at it as, what can I do? What can I change? How can I improve? I blame it on Allah. Wal-iyadhu billah. Allah protect us. Then Allah averts our attention from that and He says, Kalla bal la tukrimuna al-yatim. No, don't blame it on Allah. You have not honored the orphan. وَلَا تَحَاضُّونَ عَلَى طَعَامِ الْمِسْكِينِ. You have not fed or encouraged the feeding of the poor. وَتَأْكُلُونَ تُرَاثَ أَكْلًا لَمَّا وَتُحِبُّونَ الْمَالَ حُبًّا جَمًّا. And you love to consume wealth and you love to be materialistic and pursue worldly pursuits. So don't, as a believer, look at negative aspects as, oh, Allah has abandoned me, Allah is this, Allah is that. No, instead, change your circumstance by taking action and turning to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and not blaming Allah. And I hope that this, bi'idhnillah, has somewhat resolved your question, because again, when you ask, you need to be specific. What exactly does being dissatisfied mean? And what we really do consider is not what had taken place, but how we respond to that, and Allah knows best. We move on to the next question. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I struggle to fight urges while apart from my wife. What can I do? I assume, based on the context here, that the urges is in reference to physical urges, right? Lustful urges. So the first issue is, how regularly do you have to be away from your wife? Is it possible for you to travel with your wife or to not be away from your wife that regularly? If it is not possible, then the Prophet ﷺ gave us advice as to how to control our desire. And this comes in the hadith relating to the youth, where he says, يَا مَعْشَرَ الشَّبَابِ مَنِ اسْتَطَاعَ مِنْكُمُ الْبَاءَ فَلْيَتَزَوَّجْ فَإِنَّهُ أَغَضُّ لِلْبَصَرِ وَأَحْسَنُ لِلْفَرْجِ فَمَنْ لَمْ يَسْتَطِعْ فَعَلَيْهِ بِالصَّوْمِ فَإِنَّهُ لَهُ وِجَاء. He said, sallallahu alayhi wasallam, O group of youth, you should get married, because it will enable you to lower your gaze and it will enable you to protect your chastity. And whosoever is unable to do that, then that person should fast, because fasting will be a shield for him or her. So the scholars, based on this, had understood fasting as a tool to keep one's desires at bay. Sometimes people say that I fast, but it doesn't quite take my desires away. Generally, this type of recommendation of fasting is understood to mean that you fast at length. You don't just fast for one day, you fast for a duration of days, right? A number of days, until you feel that the body has somewhat slowed down and the desire has somewhat abated. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. Then of course, the best way to avoid, look, having desire is not something that you can avoid. It's part of being a human being. Desires are natural. But you can control how strong those urges are by avoiding temptation. For somebody who says that they are tempted by desire, but they are watching haram, they are looking at haram, they're not lowering their gaze, they are interacting with those who they can get married to with, in solitude or alone or in inappropriate ways. Somebody who makes such a claim, oh, I can't control my desire. Dear brother, how about you control your circumstances, and then that would be a means to control your desire. But unfortunately, under normal daily life in the Western world, sometimes we are exposed even unwillingly. So you control your gaze to the best of your ability, and we turn to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in istighfar for that which we cannot avoid or that which we find too difficult to avoid, and we make tawbah for that, and we try to resort to the state of fasting as a means of a shield to protect us. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make it easy for us. Ameen ya Rabbil Alameen. We proceed to the next question, inshallah. How do I purify a toilet seat if dried impurity, like urine, is present? Is using a dry tissue sufficient? So, how do I purify dry impurity? Firstly, if you come across dry impurity, understand that based on the fact that it is dry, it is not going to transfer to something else if you touch it. So if there's dry impurity, so if there's a surface like a table or something of the sort, and there was urine on there and it wasn't washed, but it subsequently dried. If I touch that table with dry hands, so it's a dry table and dry hands is touching the dry table, there's going to be no transfer of najasa from the table to my hand. If the table is wet, even if it's not wet because of the urine, let's say it's the dry surface and then a few drops of water falls on that surface and then I touch, that would transfer the najasa according to the Shafi'i school. So if you get to a public restroom and you find that there's dry impurity, the best way under that circumstance, at least in my imagination, is to cover the seat with toilet paper because it's not going to transfer onto you. If you choose to clean the seat before you use the toilet, then you're going to need to clean the seat with water because dry tissue is not going to clean the dry impurity. Still, if it becomes wet, then it can transfer. So how do you clean it with water? Essentially what needs to happen is you need to pour the water over the seat, but I hope you can see the problem that arises with this. If the water that you pour over the seat now splashes everywhere onto the toilet floor, now you've contaminated the other area as well. So when we're dealing with impurities, try not to spread it further, right, in your attempt to actually cleanse it. And I hope that makes sense, inshallah ta'ala. So again, if it's wet impurity, it is cleaned by pouring water there over and getting rid of the water, and that would clean it, right? Of course, after the trace of the impurity is removed. If it is dry impurity, then there's no transfer of najasa, right? And if you choose to clean it, then you're going to have to wet it and get rid of the water, and then that would be fine. The best option is, if it's not going to affect you and it's dry, then just simply don't touch it or have something in between you and that. And if you do touch it, it doesn't transfer onto you because it's dry and Allah knows best. طيب. How can I maintain my Islamic obligations while dealing with academic stress? There's never a situation in which stress gives us an excuse from our obligations. Academic stress can be quite stressful, whether that is at the level of, all the way at the top, your PhD, postdoctoral work, your master's dissertation, honors, degree, any form of academic work for you at that level is going to seem stressful. But stress is a means for us to turn to Allah, not to turn away from Allah. Understandably, life will present us with certain situations whereby you don't have the time, or you don't have the energy, or you don't have the sheer will, to force yourself into extra worship. And Islam is accommodative of this. What you must ensure is, as your question put it, the obligations. Right? Never neglect your obligations. If you can secure 5 daily prayers every single day, fulfilling the arkan, fulfilling the shurut, this is a means to assist you with academic stress or any other type of stress. Islam is not going to expect you to now, in this time of, constraint for you, to read extra Quran, make extra adhkar, go to the masjid as much as possible. It will all help. But realistically, you need to now strike a balance between being practical with your work while maintaining your obligations. So how do you do it? You start off with, first things first, right? Start off with your salah. Make sure that you have 5 daily salahs every single day without neglect. Number 2, make sure that while you are doing, a minimum of ibadah, make sure that you don't engage in haram. Because what happens is somebody, they're writing exams. So now they don't go to class anymore. They're not reciting their dhikr anymore. They're not reciting the Quran. Sometimes they don't even make salah, wal-iyadhu billah. But they have the time for, I need to go and relax with my friends and party because, I need to deal with the stress. Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. This is not how you deal with stress as a believer. Utilize what Allah Ta'ala had given you to deal with that stress. Read your Quran, make adhkar. If you find the extra time for that, Allah will remove that stress for you. But do not engage in haram and then say that I'm struggling with my obligations of deen. Avoid haram, make salah, insha'Allah, do the best that you can with your academic situation, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will make you successful. Ameen ya Rabbal Alameen. The next question is about what should I do if my OCD affects my religious practices and obligations. OCD, or obsessive compulsive disorder, in an Islamic paradigm is referred to as waswasa, which means the whispers and the insinuations and the temptations of shaitan. In the context of a religious obsessive compulsive disorder, there's a name for it. It's called religious scrupulosity, where your OCD is tied into certain rituals within your religion. And this is a very dangerous cycle to experience because, for example, the person starts assuming, or they start thinking to themselves, I haven't washed a particular limb, or I haven't performed my istinja correctly. So they make istinja. Then they pour some more water. Then they pour some more water. Then they think that the splashes of the water may be touched somewhere. So then they start rinsing there. Then they start, okay, now what happens to the water that's on my hand after I touch the water? And it goes on and on and on and on. And what's happening in the meantime? Shaitan is standing on the side and he's laughing because he's actually using your religion to distract you from Allah. He's using your religion to distract you from Allah. And he's making you attain perfection when you know that you cannot attain perfection. Perfection belongs only to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So what should you do? There are two ways of combating this from an Islamic paradigm. The one is that you should turn to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for assistance, right? And the way that you turn to Allah ta'ala for assistance is by spiritual reformation. Because waswasa in the Islamic paradigm is looked at as a spiritual disease that requires spiritual treatment. So for this, you need to engage in the science of tazkiyatun nafs and find the diseases of your soul and work on them by applying the remedies that you find in the science of tazkiyatun nafs. The second approach would be the psychological approach. That for somebody finding themselves with this problem, they need to seek therapy from a Muslim, ideally a Muslim counselor who understands this phenomenon. It's critically important that it is from a Muslim counselor who understands this phenomenon. And why am I saying so? Because I believe that religious scrupulosity for Muslims is somewhat unique. I can't imagine what exactly this would, sort of form as for a non-Muslim, like somebody from the Christian faith, for example, where there are not as many worship rituals, right, as there is for a Muslim. For a Muslim, there's istinja, there's wudu, there's ghusl, there's najasat and how to clean najasat, and then there's matters of iman and kufr, and then there's a matter of saying the word talaq if you're married. All of these are matters with which religious scrupulosity manifests itself. So only a Muslim therapist will understand this and would be able to advise accordingly. So both approaches are necessary, the spiritual approach as well as the psychological approach. So those are the approaches, but there's something that I believe is a standard that every person who suffers from this must reach. And that is understanding who Allah is and who I am. Understanding that Allah is merciful, He's Rahman. That Allah Ta'ala gives us a particular set of criteria. We implement that, we follow that, and we trust in Allah's mercy. We hope in Allah's mercy. Allah Azza wa Jal is not going to give us the requirements of wudu and then punish us because there's a possibility of one hair on the elbow that perhaps remained dry. This is not how Allah is, with His servants. So that type of relationship is the basis for improving one's situation in this regard. Understanding that Allah Ta'ala does not burden me with such levels of minutia that it's going to invalidate my relationship with Him. And finally, it is important for the person who finds themselves with this problem to not repeat their actions. For the person who, under normal circumstances, can't remember whether they are in the third raka'ah or the fourth raka'ah of a particular prayer, the normal rule is assume that I'm in the third raka'ah and build on an extra raka'ah. This rule is not to be applied to a person with OCD or religious scrupulosity. A person with wudu who is doubtful, did I break my wudu earlier on by passing wind or did I not? Such a person, because they know that they had wudu but they're doubting whether they broke wind or not, they would assume that they still have wudu. For a person with religious scrupulosity, they would always take the approach of, I finished it, I did it, I've attained it, so they have wudu, right? If they unsure whether they're in the third or fourth raka'ah, I've finished the fourth raka'ah and I'm going to end my salah. If they take the approach of, I assume the lesser and then I build on, they'll be building on until Qiyamah, and that's highly problematic. Then the deen is going to become difficult for them. And as the Prophet ﷺ said, no one makes the deen difficult upon them except that it will overpower them. May Allah make it easy. It's not something pleasant to be suffering from. May Allah Ta'ala grant cure to those who suffer from it. Then, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, can financial instability be a valid reason to delay starting a family in Islam? Why does one need a valid reason to delay starting a family in Islam? What is a valid reason? Since when is it invalid to delay starting a family? Is there any requisite or encouragement or instruction in Islam that as soon as you get married, well, number one, that you must get married as soon as possible, and then number two, that you must start a family as soon as possible? No, Islam is not, Islam doesn't press us on these matters the way some people think. There might be cultural pressure, there might be familial pressure and the like, but there's no pressure from Islam in this regard. If somebody wants to build them up financially first, or they just want to spend some time with their studies first, or they want to have some, getting to know one another time with their families without increasing, by parenting a child, that's perfectly permissible. So there's no need to have specific validations for why we do certain actions. If the actions are halal, then Bismillah. What Islam does say is, do not kill your children out of fear of poverty. And of course, some people, they have their own understanding when it comes to this, that you shouldn't engage in family planning, or, you should have as many children as possible. Is there a general encouragement to have a lot of children in Islam? Absolutely, yes, right? The Prophet ﷺ said, get married and have a lot of children. Right, because I'm going to boast about my ummah on the Day of Judgment in front of the other ummah. And currently in the world, Islam is the fastest growing religion, and that's partly because of da'wah, but it's also partly because Muslims tend to have more children than the other nations of the world. And this is part of the culture of Islam. But there's no hard and fast that you must do so as soon as possible and that you must have a certain amount of children. That would be unnecessary pressure to put on yourself, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. Tamam. So let's see. There are some questions that had come through, and we'll try to go through them. Bi'idhnillah. As for the first question, can't find riba-free banks with good ratings to convince parents to change my account. I cannot find riba-free banks with good ratings. So is it that you cannot find riba-free banks at all, or that you cannot find riba-free banks plus the good ratings? If it's the good ratings that you're looking for, then believe me that your ratings by Allah will be tremendous because you try to avoid the riba as best as you possibly could. Riba is one of the most heinous crimes in Islam, and that should convince your parents, inshallah ta'ala. I'm still giving away the savings of riba to charity. Gave away the current account of riba to what do I do? Now, but giving it away while necessary, and you can't call it charity. You may say it's a charitable organization, but you can't call what you gave them charity because essentially you gave money that was not yours back to the general public. That does not rectify indulgence in riba. Remember, when we have a riba-bearing account, an interest-bearing account, we are not only receiving the interest, which is what some people think, right? Oh, they give me a couple of dollars of interest, I'll just leave it there or I'll give it away. That doesn't rectify the situation. Because when you place your money into such an account, you actually become the giver of riba. Because your money is given to others as a loan so that it can draw interest. And this is part of what is seriously problematic with riba. The Prophet ﷺ said it's not only the one who consumes riba, it's also the one who gives riba. It's also the witnesses of the contract, the ones who write it down, etc. So try to avoid that at all costs. If the only issue is you're looking for competitive rates, then you should have a serious chat with your parents and explain that, look, I'll rather take less profitable or apparently less profitable rates than to indulge in that which displeases Allah to the point that Allah and His Messenger declare war against those who indulge in it, right? And Allah knows best. How do we respond to those who tell us we are wasting our time and don't need a madhab? This is very prevalent in my community. How do you respond to them? You don't need to respond to everybody who says everything, of this nature to you. The best thing to do in situations of dispute, if it's an alim that you are dealing with, then you refer to another alim to receive guidance. But if it's another person, another fellow Muslim brother or sister, you've got so much in common with that brother and sister in Islam. Focus on your commonalities and avoid discussing things like inter-madhab differences or why you need to follow madhab. If you are following a madhab because you've learned Islam and you've understood that, look, this is following the Quran and Sunnah and it's a convenience, and somebody else says, no, I don't believe that to be the case, your job and my job is not to convince that person. If convincing wasn't even the function of the prophets and messengers, how can it be our jobs? If you are asking about da'wah, how can I make da'wah and explain to people the right way? Then the answer is, first you have to educate yourself thoroughly on the matter, and then you will be able to enlighten others when they ask. But try to avoid disputes in this matter, and Allah knows best. Is sajda to tilawa a sunnah mu'akkada? Is sajda to tilawa a sunnah mu'akkada? I have to check up the specific nature. It is a sunnah. Is it a sunnah mu'akkada? I have to check up on the specific ruling in relation to that for me to be able to answer with confidence, inshallah. Can we combine and shorten one prayer but not both? Is it bad adab to shorten one's prayers due to travel at your parents' home or take other travel dispensations? There's no hard and fast in the Shafi'i school when it comes to traveling and travel dispensations. You are not compelled to take any of them or to leave any of them. So if you decide to pray your salahs in full, that's valid. If you decide to shorten your prayers, that's valid. If you decide to combine your prayers, that's valid. If you decide to combine and shorten your prayers collectively, that's also valid. As for can you shorten one prayer but not both? You may do so as long as you follow the rules of the dispensations that is taught in our fiqh. And then, is it bad adab to shorten one's prayers due to traveling at your parents' home or take other travel dispensations? As long as the journey in question fulfills the requirements that allow these dispensations. For example, a permissible journey, it must be over 80 kilometers, and so on and so forth, then there's no bad etiquette, there's no bad adab in relation to taking those dispensations whatsoever. In fact, the narration attributed to Sayyidina Umar radiallahu ta'ala an explains that this is a gift from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, so accept the gift. Barakallahu fikum. Ahlan wa sahlan to our brother watching from Sierra Leone, the west coast of Africa, and salam to everyone there. I avoid meals that have non-halal ingredients. I try to cook for myself. How to navigate this tension with my parents? Do I assume their meals are halal? There's not enough information in your question to be able to answer the question. I assume based on what you're saying that your parents are either not Muslim or they do not eat halal. In either case, you cannot just assume anything is halal. You have to ensure that it is. And if you have difficulty in terms of that, then try to find a way to not offend your parents. Perhaps you do the shopping or you buy the groceries, or when you eat, and you choose not to eat of their food, try to do it in a way that doesn't hurt them, that doesn't harm them. You have to apply a lot of wisdom in that respect, inshallah ta'ala. I don't want to upset my parents by constantly asking what's in it, and they believe any meat by the people of the book is halal, and say I'm making the deen hard for myself. Okay. So in relation to the details of the food of the people of the book, I'd prefer that you read the answer from the Seekers Guidance Answer Service, inshallah ta'ala. It is available there, and you're more than welcome to get the details, the extensive details of situations such as yours. But if your parents are eating halal meat, right, and if your parents are Muslim, firstly, and you are eating their food, then you're not supposed to be asking your parents what's in it. So the first question gave me the impression that they are perhaps not Muslim. Second question gives me the impression that they perhaps are. You cannot ask Muslim people, what's in the food, can I eat it? Especially your parents, subhanAllah, if that's going to cause them any hurt. If you know, for example, that your parents are Muslim, but they are consuming that which is not halal, right? Now you're sitting with a situation where you need to apply wisdom, try to speak to them, and try to find wise ways of resolving the situation. I asked the question a while ago. Okay. Shaking hands in the Shafi'i school, in which one Shafi'i said shaking hands with a barrier or gloves is makruh and not haram. You asked me to send you video proof. I don't recall this conversation, but be that as it may, I did not see this previously, and I see you've sent some sort of a link. I'll have to check that out after the class, inshallah, because I don't see it here, but I will have a look, bi'idhnillah. Can we use moist wipes like wet wipes for istinja, or do we have to use dry toilet paper? I have heard it only spreads the impurity. Thank you. You cannot use only the wet wipes that you refer to. So you get some wipes, they are moist. You can't use that alone for istinja. This is a very subtle point. You can do istinja basically in one of two ways, either with a solid dry substance or with water. And there's a way that you can do it with both. If you are going to be using a dry substance, then you use the dry substance until there is no more traces of najasa remaining, except if you were to use water, that you'd be able to remove it, right? So you wipe at least 3 times, and if there's still najasa remaining, then you keep wiping until you reach an odd number of times and there's no more najasa except that which is definitely going to remain behind until you use water. And that's considered clean by using a dry substance, in essence. To use a wet substance, to use water specifically, you simply need to remove the najasa, meaning the trace of the impurity, and then you need to just pour the water over that area. If you combine the two, then essentially it means you're going to be using a dry substance to remove the traces of the najasa, the ayn of the najasa, and then you use the water to remove the traces, and that's also fine. But when you combine the two and you take wet toilet paper, then you are not you're not sufficiently removing according to the dry substance rules, nor are you sufficiently removing according to the usage of water, because you're not using water. So that's the problem with the wet wipes. However, if a person, wants to use water, they have wet wipes available. Can they first use wet wipes in the way that you described and then use water afterwards? Yes, they may do so, because the water itself is going to remove the impurity that was even spread by the wet wipes. But if they only use the wet wipes, they would not have sufficiently cleansed themselves, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. Is one taslim valid to end the prayer in the Shafi'i school? Yes, it is. The second taslim is considered sunnah and not obligatory. Is it okay to buy items from a pawn shop, PAWN, like a watch? There's no problem with that. It's a transaction. As long as it's a halal transaction in a halal manner and there's nothing, it's not a stolen watch, for example, then by all means, there's nothing wrong with that. When taking views from other madhahib due to necessity, would one be required to follow the entire topic of said issue, like najasa, or the particular issue within the topic that causes hardship? There's a lot of details to this question. This is the nature of talfiq, right? They speak about the qadiyya, right? Is it one issue? How specific must the issue be? Or is it broader than that? So the safest route in this regard is, say for example, we're taking what breaks the wudu. So when it comes to the wudu, then should I follow the entire rules or the entire discussion of wudu according to the Hanafi school? If I'm going to practice what breaks the wudu according to the Hanafi school, must I take the entire bab of wudu from the Hanafi school? Is that required? Or is it only about that which breaks my wudu and those rules, right? Or is it only about the particular issue at hand, meaning the touching of a non-mahram person without a barrier in between? So scholars differ as to the extent of specificity that one needs to take. The safest in this regard is, in my opinion at least, the safest is to only take the rules in relation to what breaks the wudu from that one particular madhab, and you don't need to take the entire bab from that madhab. So again, you can take wudu as a Shafi'i. You can practice everything about the wudu as a Shafi'i, but as opposed to, what breaks the wudu, there you perhaps following the rules of the Hanafi school, bearing in mind that other scholars differ in relation to the extent of how specific it needs to be, and Allah knows best. Ruling on attending non-Muslim funerals. I believe there's a Seekers Guidance fatwa on attending non-Muslim wedding. It mentions it is disliked for Muslims to attend a wedding feast of nature. There's rules pertaining to that, but there's also an answer about attending non-Muslim funerals as well. There are specifics about how to go about doing so. Is it permissible? As a whole, it is permissible to attend a non-Muslim's funeral, but to not participate in any of the prayer rituals, to not participate in anything that will resemble their prayer rituals or that would appear to be shirk. And of course, there's differences in relation to men going to the funeral and women. Where exactly do you go? Can you go to the church, etc.? So there are details to that as well on the Seekers Guidance Answer Service. How do I tell my family this? It seems like a very technical ruling. I'm not sure what this is referring to. It's just a comment that refers to this. So remember, when asking your questions, the more specific you can be in explaining your situation, the more specific the response can be, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. Khair, I hope this was of benefit. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept, bless, guide us all and protect us and our families. وصلى الله تعالى عليه وعلى آله وصحبه وبارك وسلم. سبحان الله وبحمده سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته.
لا إله